I'm Warren Escadale, so I'm the Chief Exec of Voluntary Sector North West, and at the moment we are looking at how we support organisations, voluntary community, faith, social enterprise organisations in the North West to get involved in the recovery conversations. We've played at what part we can in the response conversations, and we very much work with partners at a sub-regional level. So in Merseyside, that's VS6. We work with Cheshire, Leeds. We have a health and care partnership group for voluntary sector leaders for Cheshire and Merseyside, which is the STP. We also run the Greater Manchester Leadership Group, and we support conversations across Lancashire. Cumbria have a very effective network of their own and a new chief executive at the CVS in Dave Allen, so we try and keep in touch and make sure we're sharing best practice knowledge, what we're doing and best ways of influencing things going forward. So I hope you've all clocked, I think it's Small Charities Week this week, amongst a few other weeks this week, including I think refugees and cervical cancer. But for the purpose of today, it's Small Charities Week. I think one of the things we're most anxious about is making sure that our stats across the Northwest are very consistent. We've had a bit of an interesting experience in the Liverpool City region where there's been a key report from the voluntary sector on how many groups there are and a key report from the social economy side from the Heseltine Institute. And the numbers haven't matched. It's caused confusion with public sector partners, and they disengaged from the conversations around numbers to an extent we would not have hoped to have seen. We know in Greater Manchester that from their research, which I think is Durham University, that there's 16,000 groups. So it's important today to remember that Tony's stats only relate to incorporated third sector organisations and do not include below the radar groups, of which we think there are around 27,000. So when you hear the figure 20,000 incorporated, you need to add that to the below the radar. We can only give our best estimates of what that is. Anyway, so I'll hand over to Tony. He'll give you the research impact, and then we'll hear from Jack from IPPR North, who's been doing a considerable amount of work for the voluntary and community sector in the North, and they have commissioned this piece of research alongside the Community Foundation in the North East. And then I'll round up and see where we're up to, and we'll do the Q&As as part of Tony's session. So I'll stop talking. Use the chat boxes, please, if you didn't hear at the beginning, if you just joined, and keep on mute. And let's hand over to Tony. Thank you all.
Right, hello. I'm just going to try and put my screen on. Is that visible? Yeah, okay. Got quite a lot to say, a lot of slides with lots of words on it, which is unusual. Normally I wouldn't when I'm doing a presentation, but as we're Zooming, it's a slightly different way of doing it. But the messages are fairly clear and fairly short, so I'll try and summarize as I go. Thank you for everybody who's coming. I've looked at the list of the attendees, which was sent through to me yesterday, and thanks also to Warren and Voluntary Sector North West for hosting the event for us. We're living in extraordinary times. I don't need to say that to you, really. We're facing uncertainties which far outweigh those, I suppose we might say, from 2008 when there was the last financial crash. But it still tells us something about how the sector responds to change. And as we've been tracking the way that the sector does respond to change, how it changes its structure and dynamics over the last 12 years now with third sector trends, it maybe gives us reasonable room for hope for the sector. And certainly it doesn't encourage me to be a doom monger or be too negative. I think there's still room to be quite positive about the resilience of the sector. And from a personal point of view, I think it's sometimes important for the sector to communicate its strengths rather than its weaknesses to those who fund it, because they want to invest in something which is going to achieve a lot, which of course it does. So the idea is that we look at what people were telling us in 2019. We'll be back in 2022 to see what has actually happened. It's too soon at the moment, really, to know. We began in 2008, but in the Northwest, we began in 2016, apart from Cumbria, which has been involved in the survey right from the start. And as Warren has just mentioned, this is a study of formal organisations, incorporated organisations. So if you find the numbers implausible or too low, that's because we don't include those who are below the radar. Here's an indication of the size of the sample we're dealing with. In Northwest England, we've got 1,212 respondents. That's a lot. Some national studies at the moment are going out with 150, 180 respondents and saying it's national, but we're much bigger than that. But it does mean that it's difficult for us to say anything at the sub-regional level at this stage, but we can continue with the analysis as we go on. This is the estimates we have, fairly good estimates on formal organisations, around about 20,000 in Northwest England, producing well over £3 billion of salary income for 115,000 full-time equivalent staff. So it's a big sector, about 3% of all employment. And if you look at volunteering, similarly, you get a very strong impression of the value of the sector that it produces through voluntarily given time. These are proxy measures. It's not real money. It's the replacement cost at either national minimum wage or 80% of average wages. So these are figures you can look at later as we get down to the substance of what we're doing. In 2019, there was a lot of optimism about. We asked a question about how we felt people thought the sector would, or their organisation would develop in the next 2 years, and there was a great deal of optimism. And you can see at the bottom of each of these bars, it shows how many third sector organisations had significantly rising income, and it rose as far as 30% for what we call largish organisations with incomes between 250,000 and £1 million. But generally things were on the up, and this was very different, if you like, from 2010, when things were definitely on the down. If we do look briefly at the sub-regions, we can see that the numbers of respondents are quite good, but it makes it difficult to do complex analysis. But we see that in terms of optimism in 2019, a lot of organisations had a good deal of success in the previous 2 years, and certainly many fewer had falling income. That's one indication of well-being. This is another one we have about financial well-being and use of reserves. And if you look at the fourth set of bars, it shows how many organisations have used their reserves for essential costs. So it's a good indicator of how many are struggling. And next time round, we'll obviously look at this again to see what's happened. But also, if you look at Northwest England, there's quite a sizable proportion of charities and social enterprises which have don't have any reserves, which means they're vulnerable. We'll be coming back to that too. I'm rushing a little bit at the moment so we can get to the main part later. Are there no grounds for optimism? Well, private sector businesses and charities are kind of quite different. Businesses tend to borrow money in order to be able to invest in their development. Speculate to accumulate, it's often the expression which is used. But within the voluntary sector, NCVO figures shows that the spending has never outstripped income. The sector is naturally cautious about money, so we need to, keep that in mind when we're making comparisons between different types of organisations. We don't know what's going to happen next. There's an awful lot of studies floating around at the moment. I'm sceptical of the findings of these surveys, partly because the surveys are very small, but also because I don't know, you don't know, nobody really knows exactly what the long-term impact is going to be. And just this morning, as I've released the survey results to all those people who filled it in, we've asked them one question just to tell us whether their optimism or their pessimism has increased or fallen. And it's and also a little box for people to tell us how they feel. And I'm getting a huge mix of responses. Some people saying, no, we'll be okay, we're hibernating, we'll manage. Some are saying it's not about money, it's we can't get our volunteers out there because our volunteers are in the third age. And others say we can't get access to our beneficiaries. So it's a great mix of things that's going on. Some people think their money is going to be fine. Some people are foreseeing disaster. So it's a very difficult situation. So I think we should step back and think carefully, and rather than being too urgent in our response. The tale of three sectors is to try and counter the tendency from national think tanks quite often to regard the voluntary sector as one entity. It isn't one entity, it's many entities. And what we're doing here, I think, in this presentation is talking about three elements of the sector, of smaller, medium-sized and larger organizations. The question is, what do you mean by small? What do you mean by medium? What do you mean by large? Nobody has a shared view on this kind of thing. So I've done a little slide to show what I mean by it, so you know what I'm talking about. Micro-organizations are tiny, really. They have very low level of income, below 10,000, average around about 2,500, but they comprise 45% of the sector. NCVO use this group as well. My small charities and social enterprises are 10 to 50,000. They're 25% of the sector. Medium ones, which most people call small, are also 15% of the sector. They have income 50 to 250. They're starting to get a bit more formal because they have staff, they have procedures, they have obligations. So they get a little bit more formal, but not that formal. Once you get over 250,000, organizations get more formal, but there's only 12% of organizations that group, 250,000 to 1 million. And then the biggest organizations, 1 million plus. Now, many of the surveys you'll see around use the first 4 boxes as small charities. So that gives you a sense of where we are. There's 2 ways of looking at this. One way is looking at the money, the monetary lens. One way is looking at the voluntary lens. And I think it's a useful distinction, and the next slide kind of indicates why. If you use the monetary lens, you can see that the big charities, the ones with 1 million plus income, absorb an enormous amount of the volume of income of the sector. The micro organizations, even though there's 45% of the sector is micro, take only 1.2% of the income. So I'm using a mix here as I'm talking through the monetary lens, and I'm talking through the voluntary lens. Those who rely primarily on voluntary support have a very different sort of experience from those which rely heavily on financial support. So let's look at the 3 types of organizations. The first one is larger organizations, which I'm counting as more formal. They're £250,000 income above. They start to have a hierarchical structure. They have a chief executive or chief officer. They also, though, rely heavily on volunteers. So we need to ask ourselves, through which lens do we look at these bigger organizations? I think sometimes organizations are critical of big organizations. They feel that they're stealing everybody's thunder, that they're hoovering up all the contracts and so forth. But I think we also need to remember that they are the only ones which can often do these jobs. But even then, many of them don't. Many of them choose not to do that kind of work. Just look at reliance on volunteers. If you look at the bottom bar, or the second bottom line, we could not keep going as an organization or group without volunteers. And it just gives you a sense, if you like, of the importance of the voluntary lens, even for the biggest organizations, where 50% say they couldn't keep going without volunteers. And I'll give you one example I have from an Age UK in the north of England. They have about 20 charity shops. That's how they sustain, more than 70% of their annual income. But those charity shops run primarily by volunteers. So it's not right for us to start thinking that big organizations just rely on contracts or just rely on major grants, because they don't. I don't think business, the bigger third sector organisations are just like businesses. Some are. I think they're proficient, they have to be formal, they have to be hierarchical, they have to be well disciplined. But I think we also need to recognise that many will face very serious financial problems, and redundancies are almost inevitable in many and perhaps even most of them. But it doesn't mean they have all their eggs in one basket. They can scale down, and certainly the qualitative work we do shows how organisations are quite good at flexing tough decisions. No trustees want to make the staff redundant. Tough decisions are coming their way, but many will have a little bit of breathing space. If they have contracts now, those contracts won't just stop. They'll have a bit of breathing space, but it doesn't mean they've got long to plan. Small organisations. So I'm talking about micros and the small organisations. They don't employ staff. They might have maybe one or two part-timers. Rarely do they have a full-time member of staff because they don't have enough income to do so. There's a great many of these organisations, and they rely more heavily in resource terms on voluntarily given time than they do on employee time. And you can actually do some proportional analyses of these things. And when you look at the micro-organisations, pound for pound, in terms, when you compare the value of the labour they produce through volunteering set against the amount of income they have, it's a ratio of about 3.5 to 1. So they are the engine of the sector, and I sometimes wonder when people say small but vital, and I sort of think, well, they're small and vital actually. So it's a play on words. Let's not apologise for the small charities. They actually do a tremendous amount and are a tremendous resource. If you look through the voluntary lens and not through the financial lens. Do we not need to worry about small charities just because maybe they can hibernate for a while, or maybe they don't need that much money? Well, I think that would be the wrong message, and it's certainly not the message I'm giving. I think small charities, they don't need much money, but they value the money that they do get. It makes them feel better for a start, makes them feel valued, but also it goes a long way. And I think many of the charitable foundations know this. They know that they can't ask charities to achieve particular outcomes. They know they can't ask them very much about the impact they have because it's too hard to pin down, as suggested here, tackling loneliness, improving health and well-being, building confidence, raising pride in the community, all the things that these tiny little organizations do, have a very significant impact on areas. And it's cumulative as well. And there will be some evidence coming out soon which shows the accumulation of support that small groups give to communities, and how they intersect. It might not be a formal intersection, they might not work together as formal partners, but they work in complementary ways. They're good neighbours to each other, even if they keep themselves pretty much to themselves most of the time. I think funders need to congratulate themselves that they do fund small charities, and I think there'll be a lot of cries from bigger organisations saying that they're desperate for money, which they will be, but I think we must not move the lens too far so that the small ones suffer. Let's look at the medium ones. The middling sort are the ones I think that most people are talking about when they talk about small charities. I think this is the group. The ones who have some staff and lots of volunteers. In the North West, there's certainly around 3,000 of these organisations which are on the go. They have around 73,000 regular volunteers. They're in their engine room. They need money and they need freely given time, and they produce around about 12% of their additional value, if you like, in terms of staff time through volunteers, which is very significant. I worry about the middle ground. I don't like the expression squeezed middle very much because it gives the impression that it's no place, that these organisations are somehow not this and not that. They're neither small, they're neither big. That means they're nothing. They are something. And I think over the years we've seen medium-sized organisations being at the end of a barrage of criticism, really, for failing. They're not scaling up, they're grant dependent, they won't take on contracts, they won't do social investment. All of these things that come through. And there's diagnostic toolkits all over the place which try to improve. They're well-meaning. I'm not saying that they're not well-meaning approaches, but I think there's a failure to appreciate what medium-sized organizations are all about. They're small but vital, small and vital, as I've already said, but from the qualitative work we do as well as the quantitative work, it seems that many people who lead and run these organizations don't want to get bigger necessarily. They don't want to widen their practice because they're committed very much to people and place. They tend to be there to tackle problems that bigger organizations have overlooked or neglected or even caused. So consequently, they're quite skeptical of being given advice on who to be and how to behave and so forth. And also, they don't work in a managerial way as the bigger organizations do. They have if you like, a flatter structure because they have to negotiate the relationship between the volunteers and their staff, which is not easy. You know, the politics of medium-sized organizations are complex. But it's precarious. I think for many organizations in this position, their leaders' commitment is very strong, but it's quite hard for them to tell their story about the contribution they make. They don't always fit with the outcome frameworks that many people want to see. But also, they've changed quite significantly since 2008, 2010. What happened was that many organizations, recognizing that the contract game was never really going to be for them, so they didn't get into that, and it's certainly less so now. They've not been able to rely on reserves or investments or build investments, and you know, it doesn't bring them much back in terms of interest, even if they do have it. So what a lot of them have done have got into trading. They've got involved in self-generated trading, whether they have a shop or a cafe, or they offer services for sale and so forth. There's a Power to Change report on this coming out in July from this study, which looks at this in a lot of detail. And what's interesting is not just that they're resilient, but also that they are quite innovative in the way that they do different forms of trading in tandem with some work from grants, some work from their own fundraising. So they're resilient, but within limits. They need support to keep going. And I think grant funding is always going to be an essential element of this. If organizations were able to sustain themselves entirely by trading, then the likelihood is that private sector businesses are there as well. Most of the markets in which they work are not strong enough for them to build that financial resilience. Having moved into trading, though, there's a problem. Many now can't actually do the trading. They can't open their cafes. They can't offer their services. They can't rent their rooms. So they have a cash flow problem, and it's one that I think many foundations are already starting to look at supporting, and I think it's a clear priority. So what will happen next? My honest answer is your guess is as good as mine, but we can talk about some other parameters that we should take into account. When we're weighing up the pros and cons of supporting organizations in a crisis, I don't believe in the imminent collapse arguments that we're seeing a good deal of in the third sector press. The sector will flex and it will survive, and relatively few organizations will go. And like private businesses, where it's very clear when you have to stop because the bank forecloses on you, many charities, they can scale down quite significantly and keep going. I think it's also premature for us to be talking about sector reform or innovation funds, as some people are calling for. We need to take some time to see how things start to shape up, and it won't be just over the next few months. It'll be over the next 2 years at least. Money is a problem. Through the financial lens, we can't ignore this. It's rarely easy to get hold of, and the ground is always shifting. The sector is competitive when it comes to the issues it supports. So there's always more claims than there is money available to come through. And I think at the moment, for what I'm hearing from some community foundations and other foundations and some infrastructure organisations, that you know, some organisations are very quick off the mark. They're positioning themselves very quickly. Others are slower to respond to things, and they may miss out. Some foundations, community foundations, are making strenuous efforts to contact the organisations they fund to ask them what support they need, and I think that's really helpful. So that it's, you know, we're seeing around in the press a little bit at the moment the first come first served type approach to grant giving. I think that's probably an exaggeration of what's actually happening on the ground. Do we focus on immediate organisational needs, or do we look at immediate beneficiary needs? That's a really tough one to call, I think, for funders, and we need to be careful how we don't go too far in one direction or the other. On the worries of cash flow, I think I've covered some of this already, but I think the emphasis on bridging the gap, I think, is probably going to be quite tricky. What happens when furloughing comes to an end is obviously going to be the pinch point for lots of organisations. This is a sector which doesn't stand still. This is the advantage of having longitudinal research, because we often hear the sector being talked about as if it was a solid state, and in fact it's not. What we've looked at in the reports this year is the enormous number of new organisations which come into the fray every time we do the study. So it has a life cycle where some organisations do close, but more often fade away. Actually, is what we find is that they scale down to the point where it dries up. There aren't usually that many dramatic closures. Everybody will have a story of some in every area that we're talking to right now, but they're very much in the minority. That might change. I don't know for sure, obviously. But we're still seeing startups. Even now, we're seeing startups, and quite big startups coming as people respond to things. 15% of organisations in the latest study we did had been established since 2016. So they're the ones where needs will be very different from some of the older ones, and they'll obviously be treading on some toes. Nothing we can do about that, nothing we should do about that. Civil society is a free and open and sometimes competitive environment. Short-term measures, medium-term adaptation or retrenchment. I think parts of the sector do face urgent need, and they need that support right now. My emphasis is quite strongly in the report on the middle ground, which are facing those serious cash flow problems, which could sink them. Very small organisations may be in a position where they can hibernate to some extent. Problem for many of them is they can't actually get to their beneficiaries, or they can't get their volunteers out. But that will recover. And we also see a good deal, anecdotal evidence, admittedly, a good deal of evidence of people being really quite innovative in how they do things in small organisations to keep things going. Bigger organisations probably have a little bit longer to plan. Some won't. You know, I can hear the questions kind of being generated in the background there. Some clearly won't, but many will, especially those with contracts, because the contracts won't stop dead. But it does mean that they have to plan for the decline which might follow when they do. So, on the final slide, the situation is alarming, and for all sorts of reasons. It's understandable that there is panic afoot. We do need to take a breath. We do need to see that problems are not universally shared, and that means that solutions must not be homogeneous solutions. They need to be tailored to the part of the sector that you're talking about. I think funders are quite good at that. I think maybe we sometimes see them as being rather distant and hanging on to the money and being very careful, but actually the work we've done in this project shows that they're not, that they do talk to each other, they do talk to community foundation, they do talk to infrastructure bodies to see what they need to do. So, you know, everybody needs to keep talking is probably really very important. We do need to look to the past to see that things can flex. And I think most importantly is that we need to recognise that the sector is populated by extremely determined people who don't give up easily. Agility is a sector strength. And in 2 years' time, for those of you who help us out yet again with a survey to see what's going on, I think we'll be able to see what really came of it. Just in case you're interested, the people who are watching, I've put one question out today, which is clickable on this site. We can send this to you all later, just to see how the mood has changed. So far this morning, a couple of hundred people have responded to the question. It already gives me an idea of what's going on, but I'm not going to tell you yet because we need to let it run to see what's happening. But it's a mix. It's a mix of optimism and it's a mix of pessimism. And that's me. I'm done. Thank you.
Michael McGinty's pulling together the questions we've put in the chat box. So if you've got any more, please do so. And I'll turn to Jack Hunter from IPPR North.
Fantastic. Thanks, Warren. And thanks, Tony. And hi, everyone. I won't take much time at all. Just to say a couple of things that really strike me from Tony's work and his presentation, which I thought was fascinating and covers so much. I think the first kind of takeaway is very much the kind of value of a survey of this scale for policy making. I think that there's obviously so much information and so much a desire to understand what's going on, and really from an organisation such as ours and others, there is a real value in getting to grips with the kind of sheer scale and diversity of the third sector across our region. And that is, I suppose, a big takeaway in that it really does paint a picture of quite how important the sector is at a regional level. You know, I think we all tell a fantastic story about its importance at a neighbourhood level and a local level, but it's clear from Tony's stats with regard to simply the number of employees and the contribution of volunteers that the sector plays a major part and holds its own amongst the other sectors and industries in the north. I think clearly, you know, COVID. Sorry, a second thing would just be around with regard to COVID. I think. I think obviously there's a clear degree of resilience in the sector, and there's I think that probably comes from drawing on the volunteers and the ability of organisations across the region to adapt and to be responsive to what's going on. And I think probably, you know, although obviously, you know, that there's clearly hard times ahead. There's you know, the sector as a whole, which is quite a massive beast, is clearly prepared to weather storms and has done in the so. But I think what really sticks out from Tony's research is the unevenness in that resilience. So I think what we really need to be mindful of, and it really is almost kind of, you can't shy away from it, is that although as a sector and as a large sector, civil society and the third sector will always kind of be there. There will always be that capacity. It's clear that there are organisations and places and people who are far more vulnerable than others, thinking about the relative vulnerability of organisations in deprived areas, for example. I wonder in particular about those who are particularly reliant on either private funds or public funds, given a likely recession and a collapse in local government finance. And as Tony mentioned, the issues around medium-sized organisations is a very clear one. I think for me, this brings out interesting questions that I'd like to. I mean, I'm sure you guys will have various thoughts and experience far more than mine, but it really brings out the importance of not just kind of targeting of support and funding, but building a kind of collaborative and greater coordinated approach between not just funders, but infrastructure organizations and all of this kind of stuff that, you know, is already happening. But in response to something like COVID is needed more than ever. And I think I'd be interested to hear about examples of where that's working well, how that's kind of looking outwards towards Westminster, I suppose, national trusts and foundations, and starting to tell a story of a sector about that's more than the sum of its part. Because I think finally there's just, given the scale of the sector and its importance to local areas across our region, and the undeniable risks that COVID and Brexit and recession and all of the rest pose, there's almost a responsibility to play into the role of around the conversations around the future of the north of England. I mean, drawing on the fact that, you know, the north has clearly a lot of a great many strengths. It also has some significant weaknesses and has been overlooked by policymakers in Westminster for decades. Increasingly, there are conversations happening at pace, driven primarily by public sector leaders and the private sector about the future of the region, that play into some of the conversations happening around in government that were pre-pandemic and that will come to the fore again as we start talking more about the recovery and the need to invest and build back better. So, I mean, I think we can't rely solely on central government. It's clear that I think for example, the support that's been made available to the sector to respond to COVID has been nowhere near enough. It's the response from regards to COVID has been highly centralized. It's embraced privatization wherever it's wherever they've been able to, it seems. And I do worry very much that the same thing will happen in the recovery. I think there is clearly a huge funding challenge with regard to local government, but increasingly there are some very positive conversations happening across the north, where leaders are coming together to start to articulate a wider vision for the future of the region. And I would suggest that a lot of what's the report shows is that the third sector needs to be playing a part in it, and a much stronger part perhaps than it has done to date. Sorry, it's a bit of a random reflection, but I hope that's useful. And to be honest, I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Go on, Michael. Sorry.
I've got quite a few questions, so I'm just going to post all of the ones that I've seen so far in order from top to bottom into the chat now. So would you like to start addressing them, Tony? And Jack, I think there's one in there for you too.
I'll ask one to begin with while we're waiting for that. One of the things that it looked like was happening from the research is there any sense in which voluntary sector groups will be most vulnerable, Tony, to going under?
Going under is a big word, and I don't think many will go under. I think though there will be a very large number of organisations which scale down their activity. Knowing, as I do, so many organisations, and knowing I do so much from what they tell me in surveys and so forth, I don't get the impression that many people in the sector are ready to throw the towel in. I think they're very committed to the areas within which they work, and certainly because the sector is essentially a local sector. Most organisations work, you know, within a single local authority, and many work within a single neighbourhood. They aren't just there to deliver things for their neighbourhood. They are part of that community, and they can be very reluctant to jack it in. Basically, they're not going to do that. So I think, are we really in the territory of talking about closure, or are we talking about the territory of retrenchment or reduction in the scale of what they can achieve? And I think that's the real massive worry for me, in a sense. It's not that they're going to go away, it's that they haven't got the resources to actually deliver what they must. Just from my mini question this morning, I was asking, as everybody does, do you think the demand for your services is going to increase? And it's a slightly mixed picture. Most people say yes, they do see that the demand for the services are going to increase. But some are saying that the demand for services has evaporated because people are too scared to go out. And there's 2 or 3 charities who look after the interest of older people have raised that point with me just this very morning, saying a worry is, how do we keep connection with people who need our support but are too scared to come out and get our support? So I mean, resilience is a funny old word, isn't it? I mean, it gives the impression that everything's all right if everybody's resilient. That's not what I mean by it. The resilience I'm talking about is the eagerness or the commitment to continue to support the communities of interest or the communities of place that they represent. The scaling down of activity, which is probably inevitable financially and in terms of volunteer time, certainly in the short term, is the worry. I don't know how many will close. I will be able to tell you in 2 years' time, because I've got a cunning plan to look at that. And so we'll know then. But there'll be some famous ones go. There'll be a lot that don't.
It's the pressure on services that will be the and what we can offer as a sector.
Yeah.
Just in terms, I'll pick up Angela's question. That's a good old chunky question from Sally that covers a broad landscape there. I'll just skip that for now, apologies, and go to Angela's question, which is, do the figures include sports clubs and teams? Does this get to the issue of below the radar and incorporated?
We do include, I can never get the acronym right, the registered sport clubs, it won't come to me, but the amateur sports clubs anyway. Yes, we do, and we've been in touch with Sported, who pushed it around to those organisations across the north of England, so that we've got quite a good representation. I have to confess that I haven't yet pulled them out as a separate category to look at them in any depth, so I couldn't tell you on the spot whether their situation is different, but yes, we do have them.
Steve asks, do we think mergers will become more prevalent? I think we've seen a number of conversations around premises as well. Charities have reevaluated how useful their premises are on their costs and their delivery models.
Yeah, the reason for me smiling with ironic rather than humorous. It's a note of caution. Here's a big note of caution for everybody. Don't get into bed with another organisation when you're both or one of you's in a crisis, because it isn't going to work. And if you do decide that merging is the thing to do, make sure you're doing it for precisely the right sorts of reasons. We have one famous quote, famous in my mind anyway, from Third Sector Trends about mergers and so forth, about due diligence, where the sector is not always so good at delving properly into the situation of the organisation which they might think of merging with. And the famous quote is, the trouble with due diligence in the third sector is that it's seen as being a bit rude. If you're going to do this kind of stuff, you're going to have to be honest and open with each other about where you are, because 2 organisations in trouble, in a sense, can kind of double their trouble, politically within the 2 organisations, politically for the staff within those organisations, politically the volunteers and the trustees of those organisations. An awful lot to tidy up very quickly. To do it in a panic, to think it'll get you out of trouble is risky. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't work. Good mergers can work, but I'm not sure this is the time to be doing it. it takes a good year or more to do these things well, really. So be careful is what I would say. Will more people be interested in it? Probably not. Not many more. It's not a popular sport.
I think it might be more about co-location of services might become rather.
That can work. That's a different way, providing that they're good neighbours to each other, that they respect each other's patches. That can work really well. Complementary behaviour like that is terrifically useful. And one of the things from the thing I sent out this morning again, because as usual I make my own predictions and wrong as ever. A lot of organisations were saying that they saw partnership working as being very much on the up, but that would probably be short of things like merging. It'd be more about that complementary work that you're talking about there, Warren, I think.
We've got a few big questions from Kath and from, I think it's Sally, around I'm going to paraphrase this rather than give you the long questions. It's that pipeline of investment. I think we've been making the case nationally that we need investment now for this 3-month period. But what do you see kind of happening in terms of that investment, and what should the messaging be nationally around the investment the sector needs over the medium and long term? I suppose that's the best question for paraphrasing.
Yeah, this might be one for Jack as well, actually. I suspect that it's too complicated to answer at the minute. I think probably we need to do is stratify the question to some extent, where we look at the 3 sectors I've been talking about, but also maybe talking about the areas of benefit need that we're looking at as well. I'm not so good on the arms of government. Jack might be better on that one.
Do you want to answer, Jack?
Sorry, could you just repeat the question? I was momentarily distracted.
What do you think we should, as a sector, be saying nationally in terms of we've focused on the next 3 months and saying this is the shortfall and the damage that this has done to the sector. But what should the messages nationally be around investment in the sector over the medium and long term?
Gosh, that is a big question, isn't it?
Yeah, great. Especially if you didn't hear it the first time when you have a chance to think.
I think, I mean, there's obviously what can the sector say nationally, and as I suggested, I think there's certainly conversations to be had to my mind to the kind of charitable trusts and foundations to make the case for to pick up some of those issues around the importance of place-based local support, to be mindful of some of that unevenness in where issues are going to face. I mean, in terms of lobbying to central government, I mean, it's a really tough one, and I think, to be honest, the real value is in telling a story about the role of the sector as part of the north of England, and that, previously we've had the Northern Powerhouse. We're talking about pre-pandemic it was levelling up, and Boris Johnson continues to talk about that, even though it's not very clear exactly what it means, but it's a handy catch-all phrase that they're repeating, and seems to have some resonance with regard to tackling inequalities where that is. But I mean, certainly how the sector can talk to those, talk to the combined authorities and the mayors, your LEPs, and those conversations which are happening now about how we build back better at the northern level, and to make the most of the region's considerable strengths. I would suggest that's it's a better route into having impact.
And I'm hoping IPPR North will be using this research in order to do some of that work as well.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, there was a question about that. It might have even been you, right?
It was, yeah.
I think I think, well, just to be clear, we didn't fund this. We're nowhere large enough to do that kind of stuff. But we've been working with Tony to bring in some funds, and we'll continue working with him to disseminate some of this work to stakeholders and policymakers across the north and elsewhere. We're hoping to publish with Tony a comparative analysis of organisations in the north versus the rest of the country, which is an extension of the survey. It's the first time it's run, so I'm hoping, pending some further conversations with Tony, that we can get that out rather soon and play into that that kind of debate. As I say, our priority is to not only highlight the importance and the role of the sector as a key player in the north, but to bring in some of those to start joining up some of those conversations that it tends to be. I think, despite the best efforts and some fantastic work in certain places, we still tend to be talking about the economy in one box and what that's needed, and then often we talk about the third sector and civil society as though it's a completely different world. And we would like to try to use this work to bring it in and to paint a picture of the role that, in particular, the third sector and a thriving third sector can play in the health of the northern economy as a whole.
Thank you. The next question I'll pick from, I think Ben's got a few in there. I'll just go with the second one in there. Is there any analysis about BME voluntary sector organisations in the study, Tony?
Yeah, there is. It's not published yet. There is some in the report that is released today. We've been looking at this throughout the study. We've had a separate category of organisations which look after the interest of BEM communities. If we don't mind me using the shorthand there. And last time round in 2016, we extended that to look at the role of volunteers, and we looked at BEM volunteers compared with other categories of volunteers to see what was going on in the sector there. But this time we've actually looked at sector leadership, and now I haven't finished the report yet. It's nearly done. But this will be coming out in probably three weeks' time. And what we've looked at, and some of the data is in the main report, is the proportion of graduates, retired people, women and men, white or BAME leaders, that's either chair or chief officers, and also disabled, people who are registered disabled as leaders or chief officers, and trying to look without actually making any judgments about the landscape. And I think it's important with third sector trends. It's not a campaigning type of study. It's a study with no interest, if you like. The idea is to take a look, see what we find, and for others to make judgments on and what should be done. But with the first study now, which has got any kind of decent sized concrete evidence, if you like, on leadership in the sector, we show that in terms of chairs of organisations that BEM groups are underrepresented, especially unfortunately in the Northwest, by population averages, and the same is the case of chief executives. Those organisations which do have BEM chief executives tend to be smaller ones. They tend very much so to be organisations which are dealing with BEM issues. There's some areas of the sector, some beneficial areas of the sectors where BEM groups are not represented in as chairs or as chief officers, and that would undoubtedly be, say, in rural areas that might reflect to some extent local population, but might reflect something else as well. Interestingly, we've looked at the size of organisations to see whether the number of BEM chief execs falls as the organisations get bigger, and it does. It does fall dramatically until you get to the very biggest organisations with 5 million income of 5 million plus, and then it leaps up to the national average. So there's something going on there that is quite interesting as well. So yes, we are looking at it. It'll be out in probably about 3 weeks. It'll be there as a statement for people to study and make comment on. But I probably won't. I'm going to deliver the data, if you like, and then let people decide what they think it actually means, because I'm not entirely sure that I do.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you for your input today. Thank you, Jack. It's been really fascinating. The chat in the chat box has just been amazing. I think we've got more uncertainty at the end of this than we did at the beginning. Some of the issues flagged up in the chat box are just spot on, really good, and we clearly need to do more to pick up on some of those conversations, and we'll try and do what we can as VSNW. There needs to be more conversations about what's going on and how we move forward. Just in terms of us, if you're not a member of VSNW, please sign up. It's free. We are looking for trustees. We will be supporting the recovery conversation. So I'm going to be pressing Tony, who doesn't, for kind of some data around some of the local resilience forum geographies, which are pressing us for a sense of what the sector looks like at that level. Some of the slides in there were just fantastic, and we can just use off the shelf. We will be circulating the slides. We will be circulating the video of this, and we'll see what we can do about some of the questions and suggestions in the chat box as part of the follow-up activity. So thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for Tony and everybody that helped Tony with the research. Is there any key pressing questions? If you want to ask one question more, we'll do that. I think we've come to the end of the time, to be honest, because the participants have dropped right off over the last 10 minutes, which was what I was keeping an eye on. But if you want to raise your hand for one question, we'll unmute you and listen to you. There's one big question. Carolyn Otley, are you going to ask that massive question that you've put in the chat box? Go on then.
I am, because I know Tony's talked about it before when he's been in Cumbria, and that's that there are clearly some differences in what the third sector looks like in the more deprived areas. My question, which Tony may have seen, is that given it looks like the impacts of coronavirus are much bigger in deprived areas and on communities that were already disadvantaged, how do you think that's all going to play out as we move into recovery?
Wow. Yeah, that is a big question. In the report, there's as ever, there's quite a lot of analysis of which the sector organisations are under the most pressure, and it's a mixed picture in 2019, where the many organisations are doing very well in poor areas, and some are doing quite badly. So it tends to be more extreme of doing well and doing badly in the poorest areas compared with the richest areas. I suppose this question of need is quite pressing, and there's some issues which I haven't resolved yet in my own head, and I don't quite know how I'm going to either, around the contribution of charities to issues surrounding poverty and deprivation. When I've looked in some depth at the impact that the sector feels it wants to make to the world, I suppose I'm quite surprised, really, that how few organisations prioritise lifting people from poverty or alleviating the problems of poverty, or attending to areas which are, suffering from significant deprivation. And I don't quite know how to make sense of this. So I've been talking to people, and there's a lot of people here now who are listening as well, and will have things to say about this. But some people say to me that, well, the reason why they don't say that poverty is important is because it's what they do all the time. That's just what they do. But I'm not fully convinced by that, because I think I would, if I was a charity doing that kind of work in the poor area, I'd tick the box. I'd say, yeah, absolutely, of course we do. That's precisely what we're here for. And it brings back to a whole question about social capital, which again is worrying me. I mean, when I'm giving a presentation, I pretend not to be worried, but when we're asking questions, I can start to express more concerns. But Warren has mentioned at the start about the under the radar groups, and I had a little look around the evidence last night, not just my stuff, but from other people as well. And John Mowen's research from Southampton University showed that there tend to be more under the radar groups in richer areas because they tend to attend to things which are around building social capital or securing social capital, embedding social capital, if you like. And just in my mini survey this morning, there's been a few arts groups have written to me. We have many art groups in the survey who say that they are undoubtedly having to pretty well shut things down for the moment, and are worried about how they can get things going again. They're worried about fundraising and so forth, because that is the essence, if you like, of their more affluent communities. There's lots of those groups around. What is harder to discern in the poorest areas really is whether there's a different form of social capital rather than the lack of social capital. People often use this term charity deserts about poorer communities, and I really hate it because I don't believe it's there. More charities are focused in poor areas than there ever were in the rich areas, that's for sure. Partly that's because the rent is cheap, and I can demonstrate that many charities which are based in the poorest areas don't just work in those areas, they can work across a much wider range of places. So it's really hard to unstitch all of these sort of things. The big issues, I suppose, in the poor areas are around maintaining the social glue. There isn't an absence of social glue in less advantaged areas. It's just a different kind of social glue that operates. So I think probably, investors need to be looking at the imperceptible advantage that those organizations bring, rather than focusing too much on perceptible advantage. When I ask a question about can you lift people out of poverty, for example, is a really tough one, because where are your success stories? Because poverty is, a hugely complex problem. You can't just fix it. There's all sorts of reasons why you can't. And maybe you were fixing it, and then COVID came along. People lose their jobs. They're back in trouble again. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question or not. Really, I think it's a way of thinking about less advantaged areas, of not focusing on middle class style forms of social capital, but focusing more on the kinds of social capital which is valued in those areas, or the social glue, if you like, which keeps things going. So things like community centres, things like tea dancers for older people in community centres and so forth. Those things being absent will be perhaps a more serious problem, where they have fewer alternatives of other things to do.
Lovely. Any more questions? No. There's a few in the chat box. There's a lot of conversations. Some of these are not necessarily for Tony, though his opinion's always interesting. But if everyone's happy for that, there's been a bit of a drop off in participation. I know we're all living on this hour I'm zooming here and this hour I'm zooming there. If there's no more questions, we'll wrap up there, and we'll send on the stuff so you've all got the content, and we'll share it around the Northwest. As I mentioned before, if you want to sign up to our bulletin or to us as a member, please do so, and we'll send the links to that. All right, I hope you all have a good day.